thank you for joining us tonight on a special edition of the show. I was fortunate enough to moderate a panel last evening on migration governance in Africa and implications for foreign policy. And the keynote speaker was Dr. Mehari Tadel Maru, who I will introduce shortly. And one of the panelists was Mr. Ali Abdi. I will also introduce him shortly. I asked them to join us on the panel to shed a bit more light and give us some insights on migration and what it means for Africa, and especially Uganda. I know when we talk about that, we really usually, go towards refugees. So I want us to shed a bit more light on that and understand it better. So let's say it as it is. Right, I'll start with a brief introduction of our guests. At the very end is Dr. Mehari Tadel Maru, who is currently a member of the Technical Committee of TANA High-Level Security Forum, modeled on and uniquely related to the Munich Security Forum for Africa. He's also a member of the AU High-Level Advisory Group and Chief Strategist for IGAD, including the South Sudan mediation, as well as Principal Researcher for AU, GIZ and IGAD-led Migration Expert. He holds a Doctorate of Legal Sciences from JL Gießen University, Germany, an MPA from Harvard, and an MSc from the University of Oxford, as well as an LLB from Addis Ababa University. That's a mouthful of a profile, and I'm sure they only picked a few things from it. Welcome, Dr. Mehari.
Thank you.
And right next to me is Mr. Ali Abdi, who is the International Organization for Migration, IOM's Chief of Mission in Uganda. He has worked for the IOM for over 14 years, and over the past 10 years, he has served as IOM Chief of Mission in Guinea, Conakry, Somalia, and Uganda. Very warm welcome, Mr. Abdi. Also, tonight we're talking about migration, and I know that we usually then tend towards refugees, especially when you're looking at it for Uganda. But my first question to you both, are we all not migrants?
Well, I think by definition, migration is about movement from one place to another place. Usually it's defined as movement from habitual residence, a place where you used to live, and you move to another place. So all movements of people are migration by definition. There could be several kinds of migration. Some of them are rural to urban migration, which we are used. Most of African countries are facing that with urbanization, big urbanization. You can see Kampala. It's a lot of people coming here, and also in other smaller towns, people come from rural area to urban area, sometimes also to other places like mining places, where there is also cultivation, agricultural activities, or trading in the cross-border areas. We know the boda, the term boda. Boda is border with bike and motorbikes and so on. And that's migration itself, moving from one place to another.
So we all are migrants?
Indeed, we are all. Human beings are migrants.
Okay. When we speak about migrants and then we look at refugees, what is the relationship? Is it choice?
Well, refugees are different. Refuge, by definition, refuge is to take protection from something that is adverse to you, or an attack on a person's livelihood or life, most of the time on the life of survival of a person. So it's related to risk, threat, not only vulnerability, like you're exposed for various things. So refugee is basically a person who needs protection because the system where he is habitually residing or staying, where he was working, living, or staying, cannot anymore provide him some safety, and he has to get, or she has to get, a protection somewhere else. In international law, it has gained a different definition than the dictionary definition. Refuge before was you go to monastery, you're protected by the monasteries or churches or other faith-based organization. They will give you refuge. Or even during rainy storm and so on, you take refuge. Now the definition of international law has changed. That refugee is a person who crosses international border, and the reason is because that person gets protection by another country, which was not necessarily the first country which was supposed to protect him. So any person who crosses international border seeking some protection is considered in general as a refugee. There are detailed definitions which are legalistic, which may not be interesting here, but there is a convention at the UN level, which we call 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, and the OAU also has come up with a refugee definition which is specific and peculiarized, or at least adjusted for African context. For example, anti-apartheid struggle, anti-colonialism struggle. For those people who were struggling against apartheid or colonialism, they were given refuge immediately, which may not be covered by the UN Convention.
Are you saying that refugees then do not in any way fall under the term migrants?
They do fall under migrants.
So I just want to make that clear, that in then this discussion that then follows, when we talk about migrants, we're talking about both, we're including the refugees as well.
Yes, it's
Okay.
broadly defined, broadly defined movement of people. If it's migration, then refugees are moving from one country to another in seeking protection. Now, in practice, increasingly, there is a distinction between those who move for greener pasture, better lifestyle, livelihood, making more money, or better education, tourism, and so on. Those all also moving. They could be considered as migrants, which are different from those who are seeking protection. These are trying to improve their livelihood.
Right. From your research, I don't know if you want to jump in now, Mr. Abdi, what has informed migration in the past? What is informing it today? And what does the future look like for migration?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think migration, I think in the current context of today is a much younger demographic, and mostly coming from countries from the southern hemisphere, and I think with the advent of technology, the world is now a smaller place in terms of what we hear about other countries and in terms of exposure. So I think that the digital age also has brought the world closer. So I think this is that aspect, and of course I think with increased wars and so forth, I think conflicts have also been perpetuated an increased movement of migrants as well, but also climate induced as well. This is also another category of migrants that is now increasingly coming to the limelight, and specifically when it comes to climate induced migration. This is obviously a forced and imposed condition. But when you're looking at voluntary migration in terms of people looking for greener pastures or looking for opportunities, then it is a little bit more complicated in terms of how you place them, and because there's no particular convention that protects them and so forth. So and this is where I think for the last 2 years there's been this discussion at the UN level and at the in the international community. I think all 193 member states, I think since 2016, have been debating to see how they can tackle migration, how they can govern it, and because it is an issue, it's a situation that needs to be managed. And one of the products that came out with is the Global Compact on Migration that was ratified in 2018, and I believe a good majority of the countries of the 193 member states signed it. And this now is a comprehensive framework. So we now have something that is closer to a legal framework that would allow countries to address the benefits, but also the challenges of migration, specifically today's migration.
Are we then saying migration is a thing that's going to grow into the future? Is it going to increase?
Well, absolutely, migration is inevitable. It's actually desired, and it is. I mean, mankind, since the beginning of mankind, we've all been on the move, and and I've been a migrant. I've been on the move for the last, I think, 3/4 of my life. So and that movement will continue. That mobility is something that is with us. But today it is. It is. Unfortunately, it also comes with certain level of vulnerabilities as migrants fall into the wrong hands. They fall into into slavery, they fall into trafficking and so
Or
forth.
they're just not
smuggled.
welcome where they go.
Or they're not welcome,
Exactly.
where they're now put in transit, what do you call, camps and transit centers where they're held, and reception centers they call it sometimes. And then, you know, so they can move forward, they can go back. Then we have to look at how we can repatriate them and bring them back to their countries. But also a returned migrant also carries some kind of a stigma. You know, you failed, your family has invested in you, they've sold the house, and now you come back a failure. So there's also that stigma that is attached with it as well.
Okay. What do we do if we're looking at a picture of increased migrants going into the future and unprepared nations? What are we looking at? What do we do with that?
Yeah. Well, I think ultimately migrants are human beings. As human beings, all states have responsibility in protecting and providing for, in general, opportunities for migrants. The number, as it has been said earlier, Ali has said it, and that it will increase significantly because we want it. We are developing a lot of documents, instruments, policies for free movement of persons, even in East African Community or IGAD or African Union level. We are building a lot of corridors, roads that connect Uganda, for example, with almost all railways, aviation connectivity, airlines, and so on, even new national airlines being established and so on. All these are for humans to move, not only goods, as many would prefer, as many countries or people, but increasingly people will use this connectivity for movement. So it's inevitable this number will increase, and as such countries have to be prepared to make sure that when people move, many of the things that are desired should happen with the movement of people. So the first one is to protect migrants from fundamental threats or violations of human rights, to put it, the human rights of migrants in general. That as human beings, they enjoy human rights, they have to be protected from any kind of violation. And beyond that, the facilitation of their movement will be helpful. When they move from one country to another country, they have to have documentation and so on, but at the same time, governments will be also obliged to make protection of their rights and avail significant resources for them to either trade, to go to education, to visit as tourists, in the way that we would like a person to enjoy when he moves or she moves. In some aspects, when it's a refugee situation, it's protection, which needs also a significant resource with the host community, with the countries.
When you speak about the refugee situation, then we're not looking at a refugee having to leave his home with all his documentation that's going to allow him to get a bit of a peace of mind while he's in the other country and he's not being hounded. But then you also spoke about, the way you speak about it then brings in the question of a lot of other countries are now putting a hold on migrants. They're becoming more and more strict on all of that. But we're going to talk about that a bit more when we come back from this break. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. Tonight we're speaking about migration and the bigger picture of it. And in the studio I have Mr. Ali Abdi and also Dr. Mehari Tadel Maru, and we've been speaking about migration. Now, the same question I posed the other day, and I'll put it here again. Our poor countries, and you ran away from it the last time, our poor countries seem to be more welcoming of migrants. They just, take in everybody. The richer countries are a bit reluctant on that. And yet you find that the poor countries are the ones with the biggest problems and their people are running away. It feels like, to use an analogy, the case of a parent taking better care of the neighbor's children and neglecting their own.
Very difficult to put it that way. I would say, in general, Africa especially, has been hosting most of the refugees, and communities have been very generous to host and share what they have. And this has been recognized, and in all official documents of the OAU and so on, this has been a very important asset of Africa. Now, refugee hosting is a responsibility of the international community. For example, when Uganda hosts refugees, it's doing it on behalf of the international community, because the protection of refugees is a human rights issue, fundamental human rights issue, that there is an agreement, international agreement, that the international agreement is to be implemented with solidarity and support to each other at international level. There we have a lot of weaknesses, that the burden is not shared very well, equally, that the responsibility is not taken by others who are distant from the refugee hosting countries. That should be adjusted. But suffice to say that when refugees leave their country, they are in need of specific protection. And it's incumbent on anyone, any human right respecting country, to provide those kind of protection. When it does, of course it has to do it in collaboration with the host communities, so that the host communities will not also extremely stressed by this protection as asylum systems. And that's where we need a balance. In general, the international community didn't share sufficiently the burden and the responsibility of African countries which are hosting millions at once. Some of them were hosting a couple of millions at once. For European countries, when they host even less than 100 and 1 million, even in rare cases, they become too jittery, and there is a lot of political chaos that is created by politicians. Partly, like you said, the readiness in terms of protecting refugees' rights is not entrenched fully. And that is something that, like Ali was saying earlier, the new global compact on migration, new global compact on refugees aims to address this responsibility sharing more equitably along the international system.
Well, when we, and I'm going back still to the same question, the residents of host nations, so look at Uganda, for example, you have over 1 million refugees. They have concerns, you know, when there's an influx of refugees that come in, people fear they're going to destabilize their societies. They're legitimate concerns. We can't, you know, wrap them away. How do we address these concerns?
I think one of the key points is to always try to strike a balance. I think the refugees, Uganda has, as you said, a very
we have wide open arms.
Progress, exactly.
Sure.
But I also think that everything has its limits, and I think this is why, as Dr. Mehari was saying, it is important that this responsibility sharing aspect comes with it. At some point, Uganda will come to a point where it can no longer host any more refugees, where land will be limited, and right now, I think in certain areas, the allocation of land has even decreased. Food supplies, food rations have also been halved in certain settlements. So this is, so slowly, if this continues, then Uganda will reach a breaking point where it has to say, look, I'm trying to do my best, but you know, you also need to step in. So this is, I think, where the international community and all of us have a responsibility to come to ensure that this responsibility share comes in. But also, I think, is also to also sensitize the population as well, so that they understand. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do through this show, is to understand, for, you know, Uganda historically understood what displacement meant. It had gone through its own displacement and understand. And I think this is why, as you said, why some countries are more predisposed. I think for historical reasons, when you know and you've walked in someone's shoes, you will understand better where that person is coming from. And I think it's that spirit that has allowed, in a sense, yes, the international community has come, but I think fundamentally Ugandan has owned up to its responsibilities, and I think for that it should be commended, but it should also be supported.
Okay. When you spoke about responsibility earlier, but is there a responsibility that's placed on the countries where the refugees are coming from?
Yes, I mean, by definition, the reason why you have refugees is either there is conflict and people are fleeing conflict, or there is extreme disaster, which people may flee, like you said, without documents, without preparation. It's onslaught and shock happens. And during those times, people has to be provided protection. For disasters, countries are advised they have to take care of prevention of disasters. If prevention is not possible, at least prevention of the impacts of disasters, responding to them, preparedness towards those. And sometimes you may not be able to predict, to prevent, even respond to disasters, but sometimes you have to adapt to those situations, unlike climate change and so on. So countries have to develop these capacities as a responsibility to their nationals. So the second one is in conflict situation, and countries has to provide to address the causes of conflict. And this is responsibility of states, that they have to address the cause of conflict so that people are not displaced outside their country and within the countries also as internal displaced persons. Ultimately, the primary responsibility of ensuring that people are not displaced is the states. The states are responsible for making sure that the cause of displacement do not happen. So this is understood, and there are a lot of efforts both at national level to develop their capacities and so on. Still mediations and so on, they happen for this purpose, peacekeeping, all those efforts of building capacity for peace and also peacemaking and resolving conflicts before they erupt, and also addressing disasters and so on, but also beyond that, making sure that once conflict erupts, there is a solution to it so that refugees return. But to add on what Ali has said, ultimately the principle is that member states of African Union are responsible for their nationals first and foremost. It's the member states which are responsible. They are there on behalf of the people as government. They have to make sure that people are not displaced. Rather, people are going for a better opportunity, making sure that they are moving around. And on the Ugandan case of being generous, something that we take as the model. In the African Union, we talk about migration governance, we take Uganda as a model. We go to refugees and IDPs management in general, it has improved significantly since 2006, 2005, 2007, when you had internal displacement, huge internal displacement in the country, and so on, especially north and so on. And we appreciate that. The international community appreciate that. We do it for ourselves as Ugandans. I think this should be done, but as Africans, but also beyond for the international community. What we need is to ask for quantification of, in numbers, in US dollars, the contribution of host communities, host country. So far we didn't do it. It's a mistake on our side, weakness on our side, to show to the world that the cost of hosting is this much, quantified on environment, quantified on land that is given and loaned by communities and so on, by clans and so on, authorities, traditional authorities. All the other services we provide should be quantified to show to the world how much Uganda is contributing to the protection of refugees. In Africa we have to do it. In Ethiopia we have to do it. In other places where we have huge refugees, in DRC, on top of the crisis they have, the challenge they have, we have to show to the world how much we are hosting compared to their small number they are panicky about of refugees in Europe and so on. We have to show to the international community that this is important aspect of protection, and Africa is doing more than its share in protecting refugees and also so on. But at the same time, we are producing many refugees.
Yes.
Through conflict and disaster. We have to get our home clean. The first responsibility is African. We don't blame outsiders first. It's secondary that I am talking about quantification and responsible sharing. It's as secondary. The first one is, why do we have refugees in the first place? It's our responsibility. We have to take our countries in order. We have to make sure that they are in order, and most of the causes of refugee and displacement are addressed, and people move for better opportunity. They come to Uganda for a better job, education, and so on, not other refugees. We need that kind of mobility.
All right. Well, let's take another short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. And we're talking about migrants today, and related to that, refugees as well. Now, migrants, call them what you will, are vulnerable. We know that the routes they choose to use, or they have no option. They've been uprooted from their familiar spaces. Do you have any of those stories that will help us understand? Because I think we understand when we've walked. When we've peeped into somebody's shoe and seen what they've been dealing with, what are some of the dangers they're exposed to on their journeys that us sitting back at home can look into and begin to understand even a little bit of their plight?
Well, if I may, there are a lot of horrible stories of migrants, especially those who are going or trying to migrate through the dangerous routes. Some of them through Mediterranean Sea, crossing the Sahara Desert. Some of them crossing through boats which are not safe, and they could lead to drowning of many migrants. We hear the news on desert days, drowning on the sea, and also even some routes to southern Africa. You have cases where migrants are attacked by wild animals, including lions and so on, or crocodiles. So there are many horrible stories. On top of that, there are man-made attacks also by human beings, trafficking, smuggling that happen, and also in the case of trafficking, especially where individuals are taken as slaves, basically, and you have also issues of rape for women, female migrants. Let me say here that more than 50% of migrants in general are women. Increasingly, there is what we call feminization of migration. Especially some routes are highly feminized. The routes, the migrants to Middle East, including from Uganda, are women, most of them. So those who are going through Yemen to Middle East countries are women, and as a result they are exposed, because the fact that they are women, they are exposed for more dangers, and vulnerability increase as the gender. And some of the cases are rape, for example. Rape is so common in many places that some migrants, female migrants, would carry reproductive health pills with them, more closely to them than water and so on, which is a basic necessity when you go and cross a desert. And there are stories, for example, on the route to Yemen, where women most often are very careful about having these pills with them, knowing that they will be somehow raped and be forced into sexual intercourse or so on. And the challenge is they know these risks will probably, high probability that they will happen on them, but they still continue to migrate. And it shows the decision they have is not about awareness, lack of awareness about the threats and the risks associated to migration through dangerous routes, but the fact that they are decided, and this is about behavior and decision in their mind, that they want to reach wherever they want to reach at any cost, including this kind of violations.
Who is paying attention to this when this is happening to these women, when people are drowning, when they're getting transported in these kinds of ways that are clearly very dangerous? Who is paying attention?
Well, I think maybe more so who's not paying attention. I think it's, and this is mostly the countries that that produce these migrants. And if you look at in certain places up along the Gulf of Aden, you have boats that leave on a daily basis, and in some cases officials in those areas, in those districts, are complicit in the trafficking or the smuggling business of migrants as well. And also on the other side, as they arrive, I think for those that make that journey, in certain places they're not allowed to dock. They get rescued at sea, and then of course they're not allowed to dock or to be, and the ships that pick them up, it's most of the times are sort of left in the high seas and all that. So these are some of the they sort of caught in that and along these desperate journeys and these corridors, be it through the Sahara Desert or the Mediterranean, there's this a bit of a blame game that happens and so forth. So many countries that are along the coast of Libya, for instance, are told to make sure that you keep them at bay, that they don't cross the Mediterranean. And of course, on the other side, they're not allowed to dock. So this is where. So I think if you look at over the years at the IOM, we've been sort of counting the so-called lost migrants that have disappeared at sea, and most of them right now include women and children, and as Harry was saying, there has been that increased feminization. If you look at most of the time, a lot of these ships carry infants that are 2 days old, and at times they're born at sea. So this has and even along the southern route as well, you see, and that journey never ends. I think at some point a migrant starts out as being smuggled, then at some point becomes trafficked, because smuggled you pay for that journey to facilitate, but then once you arrive there, your status changes. You're now trafficked because you get into bondage, and then if you get out and you manage to go to the closest government office or UNHCR, you then claim asylum. Then now you become a refugee. So along the way, your status does change along the way, and also your level of vulnerability that goes with it. So, but just to sort of, this is obviously the ugly side of migration, or the more desperate side of migration, but also looking at the positive aspect of migration. And if I may just give you some specifically when it comes to Uganda. Uganda has successfully negotiated bilateral labor agreements with countries in the Gulf, namely Saudi Arabia and Jordan and other countries. And these discussions are ongoing to see how additional labor migration, bilateral labor agreements can be negotiated with other countries. This will now be a source of revenue for Uganda. So
I don't mean to go back to the negative side,
right,
but even looking at the UAE, we know the problems that keep coming out of there. I was surprised looking at the report that you shared that UAE is not even a big destination for Ugandans, but we know what's happening there.
So the first thing is, you're correct in saying that you are surprised about the data. The data we have even now is not well informed by what is happening on migration. Most of the funding for research is coming from Europe on Africa. As a result, the outcomes of the research are focused on the route that we talk, one route only. Those that are just planning to travel to Europe most often. Within Africa we have data, but it's very limited. To Middle East we have very, very limited data, and partly because they go through illegal routes without registering, processing, and so on. Sometimes they go also through legal routes, and you don't have a full what we call administrative data or stock, proper census-based data. So the data, we cannot be 100% sure about what's happening. I give you an example from Ethiopia, from our region. In 1 year only, from Saudi Arabia, in 1 year, there were other times. In 1 year, we had 177,000 people returned, if not more, returned to Ethiopia. And the 177,000, this is the number of migrants supposedly trying to go to Europe a year, to Europe, the entire Europe. So one country was deporting a national of one country from Saudi Arabia, nationals of one country, about 177,000.
These were returned, not returning.
Deported.
Deported.
Actually, most of them were deported. Now, this, if you go to data, you wouldn't find this. The maximum estimate that was there at that time was not more than 30,000 Ethiopians are there who will be returned or deported. This is 5 times the margin of error is huge, so that it doesn't sound margin.
We can't really rely on the figures then.
Exactly. So you cannot rely on that. But why do migrants go to these countries? That is a big issue. And why do we have young people from Africa trying to go there? It's to improve their livelihood. This is a very healthy aspiration. Now, should they take these routes that are dangerous without full protection of the system is one question that we need to address. People have to migrate because migration is a source of prosperity, trade, and we said there are many positive things. Everyone, as we have said in the beginning, is migrant.
Everybody wants a better life.
Exactly, a better life, a greener pasture. Now, for the migrant themselves, there are significant responsibility they have to take to protect themselves from abuse and deaths, and including dangers to livelihood and physical safety. On top of that, countries of origin has to make sure that the agreements are protective of their nationals. There are countries. African migrants in the Middle East are treated less than migrants from Philippines, for example. Why? There are migrants from other places in the world that are working in Europe or in Middle East and so on. But our migrants, African migrants, are treated the least. And this goes back not to the nationals, to the migrant themselves. The responsibility falls again on the governments to make sure that their nationals are protected. There is a negotiation that is very refined and well taken care of by leadership. And the leadership has to take time and energy and resource to make sure these bilateral agreements and multilateral agreements are reflective of the interest of the nationals.
I heard you say that you can tell when a country is serious about the issue of migration by the fact that it has it in its budget. But I won't go there. Our time is quickly fast spent, but I had a couple of more questions. I'm hoping we can just run through them. How have countries like the US and Australia leveraged migration to grow prosperous?
These are countries that are built on migration. I mean, right now, most of these countries are sort of adopting a hard line towards migration, and which is not their historical position. Again, so I mean, many of their forefathers came by boat and arrived centuries ago, and but today you find countries, mostly in the North Hemisphere, closing up the borders. So, but it does show you that you know, migration is or migrants. Every migrant that goes to a country brings something with him or her, and they contribute to society. They pay taxes. They contribute to innovation, science, and everything else. So and a lot of the technological advances that we have achieved today in the world, a good number of it have been attributed to migrants. So so I mean, if you look at, I mean, the biggest company in the world, Apple, is you know, was founded by you know, he has his roots in Syria. I mean, so I mean, his parents came from Syria. So this is just to show you that this migration is a benefit, and if it's well managed and if it's humane and orderly, can benefit everyone.
Why do they then now seem to appear to be against migrants?
There are many political reasons. I think I put politics more than anything else in this backlash on migration. And in Europe, there is populism, increasing populism, and this populism is sometimes used by politicians to mobilize people. And the best way to mobilize is to show that migrants are coming, your country is taken over by migrants. Even if the portion is very small in percentage, it's not even, it's less than 1%, 2%, in some cases 3% maximum of the migrants that are going there in terms of population number, in rare case. Now, fraction, but they create this fear and exploit this fear for political purpose. Look at the US. President Trump's political platform was basically populist, to stir the fear and the blood of Native Americans, as they call them, who have been migrants themselves actually in American land, but they consider themselves as the first ones, and they want to determine those kind of movements of other people going there, which is oxymoronic and actually very contradictory to history. Most of them, including the First Lady, with full respect, you know, is a migrant, but to use it for political purpose, regardless of whether they believe in it or not. There are many stories where even President Trump at some point has hired migrants to work in his company and so on at home, but they still try to use it as a backlash to move political, to get political votes and so on. So it's politics which is making it difficult. It's not actually the evidence, the data on the ground doesn't show that. I give you one example. Many companies want labor. In Europe, the population is declining. It's well known, scientifically proven. And they need more people to work in healthcare, in old age care, in other sectors. They need more people to go there. Even companies would like to compete and get more people to work. But even if the evidence, the science says this, science is not politics. And politics is not followed, is not applying science properly. And that's where it becomes populism, because populism is not based on evidence, it's ideological. Yeah. It's ideologically based mobilization that's happening. So politics, the emotion that is steering the voters' emotion to react against migration. And here, within Africa, some countries that's happening. South Africa, for example, where you have Afrophobic attacks on Africans only. And most often it's not cultural threat that they fear. They consider Africans are Africans in culture. It's more job related, economic, which I think we should be careful about this one, because there is difference between the anti-migrants in South Africa or in Africa and elsewhere, which is related to culture, to other aspects, religion and so on. But in the African context, it's economic, and countries have to make sure that this doesn't go in a way that completely undermines the host communities while they allow migrants to go and work.
Right. And just to add, I mean, as humans, it's always natural. We have this tendency that when things go wrong, we always blame the other person. So I think this is economically, when we go through economic times, when things don't go right, it's always easier to blame someone else. So in this particular case, it can always be the weak in society, the refugees, the migrants, those that don't have rights. So it has always been that way. But I think this is where this discussion is looking at, that people need to empathize. People need to sort of understand that this can happen to anyone. Anyone can be a migrant. Anyone can be a refugee, especially a refugee. At one point, you can be enjoying this right, but then you can find yourself stripped of all these rights and find yourself in no man's land. So it can happen to anyone.
Well, my final question to all of you, also because I'm a journalist, so I have a stake in this. How does the media play a role in this? Because I off head, I'm thinking our job is to connect the dots. So we should be able to connect and say, well, migration is a result of, well, we could say corruption. Disease comes as a result of, migration as well, or insecurity leads to migration. What more should the media be doing? Or what shouldn't the media be doing?
I think the media should make an extra effort to dig deep into the issues. I think most of the time the media sensationalizes things and portrays things from just one perspective. Many times when something happens, there's usually a background to it, and I think it's good that you take the viewers or the readers a little bit back so that they understand the genesis of the situation. So I think that's where I tell the media to sort of dig a little bit deeper, so that you can give a more you contextualize, you give a more comprehensive picture, as opposed to just exposing something like that, and then of course this will rile the people up and say, oh, what's happening to our country.
Yeah, I think the media actually on migration is played out, basically. It's not playing its role correctly. It's just simply reflecting what it receives from political parties, political movements, or even interests that have specific. I give you an example. How many of us have heard about the southern route to South Africa, the deaths and the killings that happen on when they cross rivers and eaten by crocodiles and by wild animals on the road? Not many. How many of us do we cover the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, routes of migration or Yemen route. We focus on the Yemeni, the Libyan route, because the Libyan route is covered very well, is financed by European Union. A lot of media covers that. It is the interest of Europe. The whole European eye is on it. Media are focusing on that and they reflect that. And as a result, African media also outlets do not distinguish this one and try to balance, but they reflect whatever they get, they try to show it here as if there is no migration in the region. I tell last time in the panel, I said most migration is happening within Africa.
80%, over 80%.
86% is cross-border, including those we know in our cross-border. How much of that is covered by media? It's forgotten. Only some routes, the rich routes I call them, the rich man's route, the rich person's route of Mediterranean is covered. The poor man's or poor person's routes, Southern Africa and Yemen, are completely forgotten. They are not reported closely. Like I said, return of 177,000 in 1 year should have been big headlines. In how many of the media outlets have covered that one? A days of or a few thousand should be covered properly also in the Mediterranean, but it's given more emphasis on that because our media are not playing the role they should have played in agenda setting and also the diffusion of information that is evidence-based.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Unless any of you has a closing remark for us, but I think we've looked at this from as many angles as we could, given the time that we have. Thank you so much for watching. That was the show for tonight. Coming up is NTV Weekend Edition.